Good morning, everyone. My name is Amber Jamil. I'm the Communication and Outreach Director at Indus, and I have the pleasure of moderating a panel on Pakistan's economy. Today, we will be exploring, as the country prepares for a visit from the IMF, we will be exploring Pakistan's macro and microeconomic dynamics. We'll look at the twin deficit, we'll look at CPEC, and we'll sort of build upon the remarks that Dr. Hussain gave earlier today. It is my pleasure to introduce an esteemed panel of speakers who are going to help us really think about and unpack some of these challenges on a very topical issue. I'll start with my greatest pleasure is to introduce Dr. Shamshed Akhtar. She is a Pakistani development economist, diplomat, and intellectual who most recently served as the caretaker finance minister of Pakistan. Previously, she was vice president at the World Bank and also governor of the State Bank of Pakistan from 2016 to 2009. In 2006 and 2007, she was nominated as Asia's best central bank governor by Emerging Markets and the Bankers Trust. She has also held several senior positions with the United Nations, including Under-Secretary General and Executive Secretary of the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. Dr. Akhtar was a postdoctoral U.S. Fulbright Fellow at Harvard University. She holds a PhD in economics and a master's in development economics from the University of Paisley in Scotland, and an MSc in economics from Quaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad. Welcome. Next, I'd like to introduce Khurram Hussain. He's a business editor and columnist with Dawn, a leading English language Pakistani newspaper. His coverage has focused on Pakistan's economy and business and policy decision-making, among other topics. He has also been a contributor to the BBC, providing short features on economic issues as well as appearing as an analyst for the English and Urdu language services. He was the Wilson Center's Pakistan Scholar in 2013 and 2014. And while at the Wilson Center, he worked on a project on the political economy of policy reform in Pakistan. Earlier in his career, he taught at LUMS. Welcome. We are honored to have another Wilson Center Global Fellow, Nadia Navivali. She is a current Global Fellow, and she's a former Wilson Center Public Policy Fellow. She's an independent American researcher and freelance development journalist based in Islamabad. She investigates and writes about foreign assistance, local philanthropy, civil society, and education in Pakistan. She's the author of Pakistan's Education Crisis, The Real Story. She served as the Pakistan desk officer at USAID and as a national security aide in the U.S. Senate. She's also a former United States Institute for Peace country representative for Pakistan. She taught U.S. foreign policy at the National Defense University in Islamabad in 2014, and she holds a master's in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome, Nadia. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce James Schwimlin, a former U.S. diplomat experienced in South Asia and U.S. foreign economic policy. He is a non-resident scholar fellow in South Asia at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and has recently worked for the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Atlantic Council. He's also a World Bank consultant who focuses on China's Belt Road Initiative. Mr. Schwimlin previously served as a senior advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan at the State Department until his departure in September 2017. He has a master's degree in international political economy from American University. Welcome, James. During this panel, we'll ask each of our panelists to offer some brief remarks, at which time we will then open it up to the audience. I know that there's a thirst and a hunger, and many of you have great questions, so we'll look forward to having a Q&A towards the end. I'd like to start, Dr. Shamshed Akhtar, if you.
Thank you. Good morning to all of you. I did want to share my perspective as somebody who stepped down as a caretaker minister of about 6 to 10 portfolios that I inherited after stepping down from the United Nations. A lot of what I had to say has, of course, been very competently covered by my colleague Ishra Susan, whose position I filled in at the central bank. I'm going to take about 10 to 15 minutes. That's what I was told. So not brief comments, okay? At the outset, I'll be very candid with you. I think I'd like to give a little different twist. Rather than run things on different items, I'd like to focus very much on the fact that, as you all know, PTI government was elected, won the votes largely because they were seeking, they were advocating a change. And there has been a change from the fact that we have broken the hold of the two-party system, but a change that delivers on promises, and one of the promises is the resolution of the economic crisis. The first good news which the government has inherited, and I had an occasion to analyze, was really the growth story of Pakistan. I think while we've had episodes of growth, as Ishrat pointed out, but they have been disrupted by macroeconomic instability. So you take few steps and then you take 10 steps backward in Pakistan. Growth of Pakistan actually did indeed gain pretty good momentum from what I saw, because it was both from the demand side as well as from the supply side, and the drivers of growth were quite good. We also, of course, had a period of low inflation and low interest rate environment, both internationally and domestically. We saw much more growth being driven by consumption. Almost 85% of the growth is driven by consumption. So something is happening to the people in terms of per capita incomes. The record growth of 5.8% that we saw in fiscal year 18 is a record in 11 years. And it was double the average growth rate of around 2.8% over a period of fiscal year 09 to 16. So three features stand out on this growth, which are important to record. One is almost 60% of the growth is driven by services sector. For people who have studied Pakistan's growth composition, this is definitely a distinct feature. And then, as I said, 85% of the growth being consumption driven. There was an uptick on investment, but I think investment is a sadder story. And investment is pretty low relative to the rest of the below East Asia and even other South Asian economies. The problem is that the growth momentum, once again, is going to be disrupted quite significantly because it's not backed by sustainable macroeconomic imbalances. And it is not investment-led, and policy distortions are quite pervasive. There was no cleaning up of the policy regime in a deeper sense, and the business environment had not been fixed. My second message, moving from the growth storyline, is that macroeconomic instability persisted over the last decade, despite IMF programs. Yes, we need to go to the fund. People ask me the question. I have been hesitant publicly declaring it, but I have always felt in the 2.5 months that I was sitting quietly in my room and grappling with the issue that we had to immediately go. And I left behind 6 papers for the incoming government, and one of them was a very comprehensive analysis of stabilization with growth. For the first time, Pakistan actually has a financial programming model within the Ministry of Finance. It took 70 years plus to inherit that, I guess. So what is the problem of instability is, as has been often alluded to, that we have had fiscal deficits. They are recurring and often intertwined with the external current account deficit pressures, and coincidentally, they do increasingly exhibit a degree of political cyclicality. Incoming two previous governments have inherited twin deficits of different orders and magnitude, which resulted in depletion of FX reserves, compelling government's recourse to IMF. IMF programs, as they are always, are demand management prescriptions. However, they edge more on the monetary management discipline rather than the fiscal restructuring, and this is a defect in the fund programs, as I see. IMF programs emphasize demand management in the last few rounds, but relatively less fiscal restructuring reforms. Fund has helped cushion FX reserves at times when Pakistan's ratings went down and soliciting commercial financing was challenging and very expensive, as it is today in the international markets. And we are faced with a pretty aggressive international environment, both in terms of the trade policy dimensions as well as the interest rates. IMF conditionalities are breached, and IMF continues to change those conditionalities during the course of the program to suit the conditions prevailing in the country. Fiscal deficit, for instance, averaged about 7% of GDP over 2008 to 2013 period, even after two standbys of 2008 and 2009, entailing cumulative borrowings, arrangements of 17.7 billion, and subsequently another EFF arrangement was contracted in September 2014 of 6.4 billion. With repeated recourse to IMF and its breaches, constituencies within and outside Pakistan have raised questions regarding even the IMF program efficacy and sustainability, sometimes more unfairly because Pakistan's compliance has always been questionable. My third message is implications of high aggregate demand pressures today are extremely worrisome, and we should not underplay them. Countries' economic growth is driven by consumption, and as I said, by a very small uptick in investment, which has been accompanied by an unprecedented surge in imports, which have hit close to $55.9 billion, leading to a quantum jump in trade deficit that reached 31 billion. So a diagnostics is very much warranted before you venture off to talking about future. Import surge reflects cumulative impact of inflexible exchange rate management, very difficult for politicians to understand. Rising international oil prices, strong investment demand, and of course CPEC-related import of plant and machinery since 2015. And there was a huge upsurge in automobiles, mobile phones, food products, and other consumer goods. This is because of the consumption pressures. With import growth outstripping even the export recovery that came a little because of the global recovery in the export markets. I don't think there was a lot going on within Pakistan that led to export recovery, but it's the demand side picked up. On the contrary, my take is that supply side on the export is pretty weak because we consume so much that we leave very little to export. And our exports are not that competitive, and we have had rigidities in our exchange rate management. So export earnings financed less than half of the import levels, hence vulnerabilities in the external account. Financing external account deficit has been challenging, and it has resulted in depletion of the FX reserves from 2017 onwards, which reached 9.7 billion. I remember meeting Ishaq Dar, the finance minister, in May of 2017 as UNSCAP Under Secretary General, and I told him that he should really look at the vulnerabilities of balance of payment. I had faced that during my term in the government, and I told him any country that has a trade deficit which is hitting above the reserve level is in for real trouble. The press release indicated that I was very happy with the performance of the country. So that's what happens to people like us when we try to give good advice. But it was very impressive where we were in our FX reserves in 2016, which was almost equivalent to 4.5 months of import coverage. So coming back to my story on aggregate demand pressures, they are all-time high. Overheating of the economy was very strong when I stepped in. This is manifested by a range of indicators. One, output gap grew to 0.4% of GDP, which is relative to the negative output gap, which means there was less gap, so to speak. Fiscal deficit crept back to 6.6% of GDP, and the stock of central bank financing of the budget, which had come down significantly, went up and hit about 3.5 trillion rupees. This was sharp contrast to retirements that occurred in 13 to 15 fiscal year period, and about 2.5% of GDP above target was our fiscal deficit. External current account deficit rose to 5.7% of GDP, which was about 3.1% above targeted level. So it was no surprise to me that the inflation started to creep up, and the core inflation has gone up, almost doubled. My fourth message is that demand management is of course underway, and Ishrat pointed out to that. But new government's full strategic vision and plan will be very critical to calm the nerves. It is possibly going to be unearthed much more with the fund program coming to surface. The actions have not been taken overnight. The actions started from really November of 2017 up till the new government stepped in, and then the government also took some step. So the actions of interim and the caretaker governments, along with the new government's measures taken in its first 2 months already, have helped in managing demand side to a degree, and that will be taken as an advance action by the fund, hopefully. So the few key steps which are important to recall are that when I saw that the fiscal deficit situation was getting out of control, we tried to operationalize what had been instituted by the previous government, the amnesty scheme, that required declaration of local and foreign assets. It was successful in mobilizing about 123 billion, but its impact is going to be positive spillover will be that we have all these declared assets, and they will be the future tax net. The second important thing that took place is that the base year of fiscal year 18 being disturbed, the new government had to revise fiscal year 19 budget, which I had talked about as a caretaker government. And government has mobilized about 183 billion or so, at least on the paper. But I'm not sure that the changes will give the numbers, the revenue that is being contemplated. There have been some changes to, and in fact, some progressivity in the income tax. There are more slabs that have been added, but there is also enhanced vigilance on the tax evaders through better IT management system. There's taxes on luxury goods and stuff like that. Regulatory duties have been retained, barring few products, but regulatory duties have become a very controversial subject in Pakistan because regulatory duties are revenue collecting mechanism, but indeed they do distort the incentive regime for the industry. Yes, utility prices have also been adjusted, of which gas price is notable. And for low and middle income, it's by 10 to 15%, and the high end consumer hitting 143% increment. There have been 2 rounds of public investment program cuts, which are noteworthy, which will have implications for social and economic development itself. The development budget during the caretaker government was cut by 380 billion, partly because it was moving slow, but we decided not to go with a lot of programs. And then fiscal year 19 development budget allocations announced by new government scaled down to 255 billion. That's a steep, sharp compression in the investment program. So then there were a few other measures on the demand side, which was, given that the caretaker government couldn't introduce some new measures, we had to rely more on the side of the central bank, which is an autonomous, independent organization. And basically, they enjoyed full support from the Ministry of Finance. And there has been, since 2017, a cumulative interest rate increment of 275 basis points, and the rupee against US dollar has depreciated by 18%. There were other measures like the LC margins and advanced payment requirements and so on and so forth. In interest of time, I'll skip all those details. But having laid out the broad brush scenario and the diagnostics, I have to say that unwinding this round of intricate economic crisis marked by age-old economic and social vulnerabilities will indeed be complex endeavor. And the political legislature is only rolling their sleeves to oppose sensible measures too. Of course, it depends on how swiftly the governance of the country is holistically overhauled and how macroeconomic management is skillfully steered and reinforced by long-term structural reforms. Well-calibrated and sequenced reforms are a prerequisite for macroeconomic stability and also for economic and social transformation of what we call Naya Pakistan or New Pakistan, in the words of PTI. So what should happen? And Ishrat had a very interesting point that macroeconomic measures will have to be embedded in a program of reforms, and they have to be both medium and long-term reforms. So the first order of priority has to be domestic resource mobilization. It's pathetic that Pakistan has been hovering between 8% of tax GDP ratio to at best 11.2%. And I can tell you that I don't see a hope in the hell with the existing establishment of FBR to achieve a major transformation in this area. I spend a lot of time even sitting in the Tax Reform Implementation Committee. That is, of course, based on a technical assistance program of the World Bank. I don't think it is really doing justice to the complexity of the issues faced. Of course, there are very interesting things that are happening, but it is on a slow burner. What is important is a political step that's needed in Pakistan, which is to really tap the real tax potential of the country, which is close to 23-24%, and we have to bring in the net agriculture, real estate, retailers, large side informal sector, which are outside the tax net, and there is pervasive tax evasion, collusion, corruption in the system. At the same time, we have always skipped saying demand management should come from the monetary side of the equation. And as I said, it is important we now focus on fiscal policy management. We need to have rules-based fiscal policy management. We had a bonanza of decline in oil prices. We squandered that money rather than holding it in an account for the days like now where the international oil prices have gone up. We don't have public financial management practices of effective kind. And investment inefficiencies, use of expenditure is inefficiencies is pervasive. Exemptions, the fiscal preemption overburdens monetary and exchange rate management and generates tax distortions that hurt industry and create competitiveness and cost. You sit in Karachi, where I have been now after leaving the caretaker government, and you know the problems industry is facing. The urgency for fiscal consolidation cannot be overemphasized. Pakistan needs to deploy public funds and guarantees judiciously to not undertake investment in public sector, but to go for leveraging public sector little money to mobilize private money for infrastructure development. And I can assure you there's a lot of money there. There's need to strategize this area. We have dabbled with a private sector infrastructure financing facility in the MOF, did not do much except for a few things. And then now we have established a public-private infrastructure advisory board under the chairpersonship of a Minister of Planning and Development Reform. Provinces have their own PPP centers, and they are operating different regimes. Of course, there will be a specialized PPP infrastructure financing financial institutions. It is important that we have a common legal regulatory regime, and there is a clarity on having effective governance. We need technical competence affiliated with PPP transactions, and we need to go for PPP proper bidding, procurement, and managing the effective social and environmental safeguards. The other point that I'd like to make within the context of the fiscal prism is that we are in a federated structure. Pakistan has managed to do a good thing to devolve political, economic, and social powers to provinces. I'm a big supporter of that. But we did that in a rush without preparing for it in an effective way. Over the years, a lot of issues have cropped up which need very careful, skillful thinking. However, it is a highly politicized, and I used to get a beating from Pakistan People's Party senators often whenever I spoke about it. I hope there's nobody out here from them. Okay, well, just don't report me to a few of these people. But the issue today is that while we are squeezing the federal PSDP, the provincial PSDP has become huge. And inefficiencies in the provincial public sector development program are not accounted for in the system in the same way as we attack the federal PSDP. As I said, there have been large cuts at the federal level of 635 billion over 18 and now 19. But all this has happened. Despite all this, we have breached the Fiscal Responsibility Debt Limitation Act. Now, this has been happening in front of the parliament, and nobody questions it. They just talk about, oh my God, the debt has grown so much. But so what? The world is indebted in a big way. The issue is it has breached the legal limits, and there is an accountability of everybody there. We don't want United States to tell us what we should be accounting for. And as you heard, Ishrat, that it's not CPEC that needs to be blamed for that. The issue is that our primary deficit was in violation. The issue is that we were using a lot of the debt not for project infrastructure. We have an institution called Economic Affairs Division, which reports to Ministry of Finance. Yes, that's fine. But what happens is Ministry of Finance uses bulk of the budgets to raise really policy-based operations, which are converted into counterpart funds to finance the recurrent budgets and a lot of expenditure, which is under the budget scrutiny, so to speak. But who is conducting the scrutiny at the end of the day is a big question. And the ministry's competence at the sector level is not something to be very proud of. So what's happened is that we have accumulated debt GDP ratio of 73.5% or thereabouts of GDP, which is over and above the 60% limit. So unless the law is revised, Pakistan legally needs to adopt a 15-year transition path towards 50% of GDP. And I don't believe that we will be able to achieve this decline in the next year or so. And also we have been fiddling with moving from the gross to net GDP, and we need to avoid doing silly things in the process. So that's on the fiscal side, but let me spend few minutes on how do you deal external vulnerabilities, which is setting embedded in the macroeconomic stability, but with an overall reform program. I think we need to build our reserves very strongly. We are barely 2 weeks or so, under 1 month or 1 month. I don't have the latest figure of the reserves, but when I left on 18th August, we had raised the reserves to 10.3. I believe they're down to 8.4 billion or so. What do we do? Singularly, after domestic resource mobilization, which, by the way, I wanted to add is not just tax resource mobilization, but has to be a capital market resource mobilization where you go and tap debt and equity much more and get the companies to solicit capital from the market itself. There's a lot that can happen. Our stock market has been demutualized now, and we have foreign investment in that market, in the stock exchange. So coming back to the external vulnerabilities, Pakistan needs to go to about 50 to 60 billion of export level. Is there potential? Of course there is. If we were to stop just singularly focusing on the domestic market, we do have to cater to domestic market, otherwise we have a problem of the import bill too. So we have to move from primary and resource-driven exports to, and also move from sole emphasis on textile. I do recognize we have competitive advantage on textile, but we are at the low end. Some good things have happened though there also. We have to really move for high-tech products, but also recognizing that today they are only 6% of the total exports. To tap new products and markets, diversification should be in line with the revealed competitive advantage in agriculture, mining, animals, and several other sectors. There's a lot of good work that's been done in this area. Dynamics of competitiveness, however, can only change as innovation, creativity, technology, and FDI flows evolve efficient linkages with global and regional value chain. There's a massive amount of work that's going on in UNSCAP as well as ADB and World Bank also on the building this regional economic corridor, which goes beyond just the emphasis that's being placed on China-Pakistan corridor. And by the way, the Belt and Road Initiative is going to further enhance that economic corridor, because at the UNSCAP, we were really helping the Chinese with the Belt and Road Initiative with a lot of other client countries. One problem we have is we have to stop the culture of taxing the imports that are being used for exports. We have this massive culture of tax refunding mechanism, which I have always suspected that it is not necessarily the most transparent mechanism. So we should zero rate our exports, and we should adopt a flexible exchange rate management, because these kind of shocks to exchange rate once in a while are not very productive and do not introduce predictability. And a lot of people don't understand, and they think there is somebody who's managing the exchange rate. Of course, interventions are very costly too. There is a swap book that went up to about $7 billion at one time because of the interventions. So we have to manage the trade-offs carefully. This cannot be done until and unless we come up with a rational, simple, conducive industrial and trade policy that promotes well-diversified and competitive industry. And I do know that we have a very competent industrialist who is working on the other side in the government, Mr. Razak Daoud. He is going to be really supporting this work. Moving away from tax refund and subsidy culture, government has to design an independent tax policy away from the FBR, which incentivizes industrial and export diversification, as is skewed today towards subsidizing textile without recognizing other competitive edge that the country has, for instance, an agriculture value addition, or setting up new industry to even exploit opportunities of import substitution. We have to promote software and business process outsourcing and call center ITC services. These are going to be key enablers of productivity of our domestic industry as much as catering to the domestic market. Here also, I feel capital market needs a transformation in Pakistan, where we need to plug in all these innovative financing mechanisms and have more startups, have more venture capital, impact investment industry. So sitting in Karachi, I'm hoping to have more conversation with private sector. I opted to stay away from the government to experiment with the private sector a little bit on how one can influence them a little also in a different manner. Let me finally make a point again on the trade side that FTA agreements don't seem to have been done effectively in Pakistan. I don't know whether we didn't have good negotiators of you, but they do need a review and they need to be renegotiated so that Pakistan enjoys reciprocity. And Pak-China FTA, of course, is one area which requires to be upgraded to allow Pakistan more favorable access to Chinese market at par with ASEAN or other countries that have had FTA with China. And Pakistan should tap trade opportunities emerging from the trade war, which is going to be definitely beneficial to Pakistan if we intelligently work around it. Foreign direct investment should be attractive now more and more to enhance Pakistan's regional and global value chains. And I repeat, flexible exchange rate management has to be an integral part of industrial and trade policy. There were questions on energy. I'd like to just supplement what Ishrat Saab said in a very small manner. I think reforms of state-owned are very critical, and of course the holding company concept has been talked about for 2 decades in Pakistan, and I hope it takes off under this government finally, because that also requires effective governance, and we have a deficit of effective governance in the government administrations and even in the private sector. So I hope that Ishrat Saab, sitting in the government, can actually govern the ungovernable people there. Oh, he's there. So good, he's listening to me. I listen to him a lot. He knows that. So energy sector, of course, is very critical. And everything that he said, I'm behind it on the CPAC that he said. By the way, I'm one of the advisors, international advisors to China, that will be technically reviewing the CPAC. The energy sector problems are very grave still. And I don't know whether we will be able to generate the surplus at all. Just one small qualifier, because I think our demand is going to grow if we were to kind of go for the industrial vision and mission that I am talking about. But it is crippling our fiscal account. The off-budget liabilities have hit between the state-owned enterprise and the circular debt of power to 2.2 trillion. And I think transmission system also is a pretty sick system, but I agree with you, Ishitsab, that there's some hope there. But the distribution system, I don't know why we can't fix that, because it can be fixed. Power sector restructuring plan has to be looked into more carefully. It has to be long-term, and it has to promote a balance between availability, affordability, and sustainability. And Pakistan, of course, has added generation capacity of 12,230 megawatt over 13 to 18 period, and this is alleviating the pressure. But, and hopefully with CPEC adding more, I think what's important is now to consolidate this gain and transform our distribution and transmission system to be totally modernized, and of course allow off-grid solutions, because accessibility needs to be improved in rural areas. On petroleum side, the focus has been excessively on imports of LNG, which has been necessary, but no real efforts have been made to increase domestic production of oil and gas. So I understand there's a merger of two industries has happened, and legally we do have energy ministry, but I have to say that when I was sitting as a caretaker government, I didn't get a sense of this synergistic interdependence which needs to happen when ministries are merged. Let me jump to my last message, because there are very competent speakers who will add more value. And this is that we have to fix our macroeconomic management by not bringing, I mean, we have to bring in fund because we need the money, but basically we have to really work this with strong political ownership. We need a buy-in. We need our politicians to understand. We need a stable and predictable policy environment. We don't need to take 2 steps and then take 10 steps backward. We need homegrown, long-term solutions, not just short-term quick fixes, which are needed, but not to the extent of further creating distortion. So to conclude, Pakistan's macroeconomic outlook and resilience, I do believe, is at risk. Just because a new government has come doesn't mean things have changed overnight. These are long-term problems. They require a lot of reflections. As domestic demand retreats in fiscal year 19, because it will happen, we have had doses in fiscal year 17 and 18. So both the old and new measures will be at work. Multilateral development banks and state bank forecast our growth to slide down to 4 or 5% max. I think we will be somewhere in between. Future growth dynamics will, however, depend on how swiftly macroeconomic stability is restored by combination, at least for now, for a steeper demand management, it seems to me, because if you see the external current account deficit numbers that are in my mind based on fiscal year 18 narrative, I think our trade deficit is likely to be at the level that it was in fiscal year 18, if not higher. So this is not a fix that we can leave without demand management, but growth stimulus can be offered by fixing business environment quickly, promoting conducive, sustainable, and inclusive policies which are within our purview, and privatization of SOEs, very fast track, and getting out of the low saving and investment trap. Domestic savings are very low in Pakistan. They are in the financial savings circuit, and they are financing the fiscal deficit, not the private investment. So under business as usual scenario, fiscal year 19 budget could be above fiscal year 18 level, is my take at this point. But like every economist, I stand ready to be corrected and proven wrong for my own country's sake. But it could be lowered with right compression as we have talked about, of public expenditures, provided there isn't a drift in the public expenditure, and the new revenue measures that the new government has thought do become a reality over and above the normal growth that was forecasted. The demand management adjustment prior to current fiscal year will undoubtedly dampen surge in imports, but under business as usual scenario, current account deficit will remain at fiscal year 17 level, as I pointed out, unless more adjustment is made on interest rate and exchange rate. State bank reserves, which as I pointed out, had grown to 10.2 billion by 18th August when I stepped down. They have come under pressure, and I will not go into what I think it will go should a business as usual scenario becomes a reality. So it's important that we have a rollover of the deposits, and the debt repayments, of course, have to be paid. A financing gap can be anywhere from 6 to 12 billion or so. And of course, it is usual that with IMF assistance, we get the World Bank and ADB and the international players coming in. Even the Chinese are keen that Pakistan's goes for stabilization with growth package. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Akhtar. Mr. Hussain, if I can ask you to offer your remarks.
Sure. Is this thing on?
Yes.
Thanks very much for that, Dr. Shamshad. That was mighty comprehensive, and one's left wondering what to say after everything's pretty much been covered. So here's what I'll do. I'm going to interact with some of what Dr. Shamshad has just said. At the top of the list, in fact, while listening to her, I'm reminded that much like every other country in the world, Pakistan also has a tension between what must be done and what can be done. And that tension plays itself out differently in different eras and different contexts and different governments. But as a journalist, and I want to underline this, that I'm a journalist, I'm not an economist, I deal more with the economic stories than I do with economic numbers and data. And my eyes are trained more on the people who are the substance of these stories. Again, rather than any of the data or the numbers. Not that we ignore the data, but nevertheless, what comes top on our list is the people and the stories. So the past 10 years, what we've seen, what do the past 10 years in that sense tell us about what needs to be done to find the pathways into the future at the moment? And in many ways, there's a sense of deja vu. I mean, if you've been an economic journalist in Pakistan, yesterday Alan Kronstadt told us about Groundhog Day. It does feel that way after a certain point in time. The same things seem to keep happening again and again and again. A new government comes in, they go to the IMF, reserves build up for a period of time, a level of comfort is reached, the reserves begin to decline. And at that point, the finance minister begins to say that we've reached record high reserves. Then the reserves enter into decline. The government, and we've seen 3 finance ministers now over the past 15 years do this, say, well, this decline in reserves is investment in future growth. Therefore, these are healthy imports, these are healthy declines. And the benefits will come down the road when the investments being made today begin to yield their fruit. Of course, those fruit don't materialize. And Pakistan lands up back at the doorstep of the IMF. The next government comes in and says, well, our predecessors gave us a broken economy. I remember covering the budget speech in 2008 when Naveed Qamar had just come in, and they were saying, well, we've only just come in, give us some time, we've only just been elected, and look, we inherited a broken economy. And you can actually see that if you look at the budget transcripts, the transcripts of the budget speech. There it is in June 2008, Naveed Qamar telling Parliament that. The PPP government kept talking about inheriting a broken economy up until, I recall, in budget 2011-12, as late as their final year, they kept talking about we inherited a broken economy. And they did. They weren't lying when they said that. They inherited a severely broken economy. In 2013, Isaac Dar began his term with the same words. And you can find that in his budget speech. Just look it up. It's on the Finance Ministry website, and there it is. We inherited a broken economy. They didn't repeat it for so long. I think the word disappeared by about 2015, and then reappeared in his last budget speech before his final disqualification. And then, there it was again when the PTI government comes in, and Asad Umar is standing there, and the PTI government, its top leadership. We inherited a broken economy all over again. It's the same cycle that keeps repeating itself. And the pathway into the future, I think, as Dr. Shamshad has very ably fleshed out for us in so much detail, consists of 2 steps. And no one ever quite manages to complete both of these 2 steps. Of course, we all know what those 2 steps are. First step is stabilization. Bring the runaway deficits under control. The second step is reform. Put the stabilized status quo on a sound footing so it can continue into the future without destabilizing itself all over again. What happens when a government undertakes stabilization, and what happens when a government undertakes reform? This is something that I've had the privilege to see up close over the past 10 years. And I can tell you that story as well repeats itself. It's the same fate. No matter how different the rhetoric, no matter how different the faces in their leadership, every party ends up saying the same things and suffering the same fate again and again. So here's what happens when a government undertakes a stabilization effort. Stabilization basically means the administration of economic pain onto the population. To use somewhat crude language, but then again, I'm a journalist, right? So I can be forgiven. To use language that people can understand. Stabilization basically means the administration of pain. It means the severe, how would you put it? Compression of demand is how the economists put it. But it basically means adding to the burdens of the poor. Making things more and more expensive. And in a country where almost half the population spends more than half of their income on food, every rupee increment on their expenditure means a lot. And the number of times I hear government ministers say, oh, we're only adding a 1 paisa tax on electricity, what's the big deal? You're right. I mean, for me, it's not a big deal. For that minister, it's not a big deal. But for the person who's paying 1,000 rupee or 2,000 rupees a month in monthly electricity bills, but is only living on 13,000 rupees or 15,000 rupees a month, it is a big deal when that bill goes from 1,000 to 1,300 rupees instead. It actually matters to that person, and it's a trade-off between whether their child can drink milk every morning or every other morning. You see, that's the kind of meaning that increment holds for that person. And you're talking about close to half the population. And I'm being approximate here, but you're talking about such a large segment of the population that you've got to wonder about this pain. So that's at the popular level, that's what it means. And at the more sort of institutional and elite level, when a government undertakes stabilization, they have to then enter into the politics of burden sharing. Some people have to share a larger portion of the burden and others don't. So for instance, today, the NFC award is in the spotlight because everyone knows an era of stabilization, of very large stabilization, is about to begin. It hasn't yet begun. We were thinking it would begin when the finance minister presented his Finance Act a few weeks ago in Parliament. No, but apparently he sort of chickened out of the real steps that were necessary and presented a very diluted stabilization package that was built more on wishful thinking. And I wish I could have a moment to also talk about the role of wishful thinking in Pakistan's economic management. Because that segues beautifully into our conversation on CPEC. But pulling back to the forthcoming stabilization that is about to come our way, if history is any guide, the kind of burden sharing that kicks in within business communities, for instance, you get your manufacturers pointing to the wholesalers and the traders and the retailers saying, look, those people don't pay any tax. Why don't you tax them instead? You get the wholesalers and retailers saying, well, we pay tax on our electricity bills and our mobile bill. You've got a whole different sort of a conversation having to take place over there. And I can tell you that's a really noisy conversation. I sat once when Hafiz Sheikh, a very, very soft-spoken, mild-mannered, very competent economist, I would say, who has served in very high positions, a person used to operating and dealing in environments such as these, had to stand before a large hall full of Punjabi traders in Lahore and try and explain to them the intricacies of the reform GST that he was trying to bring in. And I explained to them why it's going to be necessary for the implementation of a value-added tax for these traders to now start recording all their transactions, inputs and outputs, how much they bought something for, how much they sold it for. And you should have seen the commotion, right? He's standing there and he's trying to inspire them and saying, we are all one and we are all Pakistani, and from Wagah to what was the rhetoric he was using? He used it in a budget speech at one point. It was something like, from Wagah to Turkham, from Karachi to Khunjra, we are one. But these guys weren't buying it, right? They're like, what do you mean? I gotta keep these records so you can decide on the taxes. And he's trying to tell them that the reason why we have these inputs and outputs, and the reason why we even have a refund mechanism, Dr. Shamshad, the people at that point, and that's something I learned in those days. The reason why you need to have a refund mechanism is not to give taxes or refund or give taxes, not so much for the revenue side, but for the documentation side, right? And he's trying to explain to them that when you do this, then you document your incomes, and when you register for us that how much you sold a particular good for, we can look at that guy's records and see how much he's saying he bought it for. And if he's understating his prices or overstating his price, if there's a discrepancy there, we can. Needless to say, it didn't work. And it didn't work all the way to the top because in Parliament itself, the RGST bill met such loud and such intense opposition. It died a very loud and painful death. I haven't seen legislation die such an impassioned death in the years prior or in the years subsequently. What happens so I mean, today the spotlight is on the NFC award, and we heard in the event prior to this, Dr. Ishrat tell us that where he was asked about the defense budget, and he said, well, that's actually not the elephant in the room, it's debt servicing. Well, yes, the budget has these rigid expenditures, debt servicing, defense. It's hard to cut defense at a time when the country is being asked to fight a war on terrorists, right? And so their response is, well, will you expect us to fight this war for free? I mean, it costs money. And for 10 years, Pakistan has fought one of the most intense, the Pakistan army has been engaged in one of the most intense fights that it has ever fought. The fight against the TTP is probably the most serious fighting that the Pakistan army has ever done. Cutting the defense expenditure in the middle of all that was very difficult. There are almost ₹1 trillion worth of CPEC commitments in the public sector development program. This is something not often enough underlined in all public conversations about CPEC, that how much of CPEC is actually being financed by Government of Pakistan resources. The majority of it is being financed by Government of Pakistan resources. The overwhelming majority. Okay,
Not really, but we can
no.
talk about that.
Okay, we can go into the numbers. Maybe I'll withdraw the word overwhelming, okay? But ₹1 trillion. And again, there's a conversation to be had when you look at where the Chinese money is going and where the Pakistani money is going. Okay, if you lay that out on a map, a picture emerges, and that picture says something. It's actually worth looking at. We can talk about that later. But for now, let me move on. So stabilization means the administration of pain and the politics of burden sharing. And that's something that this government is now about to begin. And how well they walk that high wire act, we'll wait to see. But what happens when these governments undertake stabilization measures is that their support base vanishes. Every government ends up eating up and devouring its own support base in the process of implementing a stabilization act. And then comes the hard part, which is a reform And facing the prospect of reform, of changing a deeply rooted status quo at a time when you've had to pretty much erode and eat away your own support base is very tough. So that's what we saw, and I gave the example of the RGST for the PPP government when they tried to bring that about. They found that there was nobody, poor Hafiz Sheikh found nobody was really standing by him, even from within his own party. And there was this one moment where he gave an angry speech in Parliament. And he's looking at his own colleagues in disbelief almost. And he's saying, and you know, his Urdu wasn't the best, but he's trying his best in Urdu to sound as angry as he could, and as mild-mannered a man as him, did his best. But his own party had abandoned him. And there was this one moment, and I'm talking about him, but I'll come to Mr. Dar as well in a moment. And then, of course, 5 years from now, we'll have a similar conversation about Mr. Asad Umar, because the finance minister tends to be at the heart of the whole stabilization effort. That is the individual who is tasked with implementing it and then tasked with owning the consequences as well. So that's actually another key ingredient that I'm going to use in the summing up. But okay, in the interest of speed and moving on, when it comes time to change, to undertake reform, after having eaten up your own support base, the governments find that they are actually, that the moment they undertake the reform, it activates the opposition in a way that had not been done prior. So the PPP government actually faced its first political opposition. They faced opposition in many other ways, but the first political opposition that came from within Parliament was when the RGST bill was presented, and then subsequently. Likewise, the first time the PMLN government faced the most serious political test of its own majority and its own politics was when they tried to undertake the privatization of PIA. So, and then we all remember, of course, how that turned out. And, they tried to first alter its corporate structure. Then they tried to pass a bill through an ordinance. Then when it came before Parliament, the unions were by then alerted, and protests were taking place. Needless to say, by about March, the process began in December 2014, I believe, 2015. By about March of that year, they were actually sitting down with the opposition and busily taking it all back, and gave the opposition a commitment that, okay, we will never transfer management control of PIA outside of the state. It died a very, very highly visible, noisy death, the attempt to try and privatize PIA. Because Mr. Dar had pretty much consumed his political capital and his support within his own party, as well as the party from below the line, in undertaking the stabilization that had come prior to it. Of course, with the PMLN, there was a second element that helped eat away some of their political support base, and that was their commitment to the Chinese and to CPEC. A lot of the trader and the small and medium enterprises of central Punjab, for instance, I'm talking of the industrial clusters from Gujranwala, Wazirabad, Gujarat. Many of these people who were, and Sialkot, who were staunch below-the-line support base for the PMLN, had by about 2015, 2016 become estranged, deeply estranged. And they had very good reasons. They said that we can't even get an audience with this government anymore. They don't even take our calls. They don't entertain our requests for a meeting. And we're seeing one after another Chinese business delegation coming in and out of their offices while we're sitting out here. And I said, well, if you meet with them, what would you like to say? And the guy tells me, well, and this is a guy who's a manufacturer of household appliances. So he manufactures taps and toilet flushes and door handles. And, there's an entire industrial cluster of these in Pakistan, a large one. And he says, Khurram, we are one of the few manufacturers in Pakistan who can compete with the Chinese. We can make door handles better and cheaper than the Chinese can. And we can, in fact, export to China. We can manufacture them so much better than the Chinese. And I'm looking at Xinjiang right now, and I'm seeing some of the world's largest housing schemes coming up in Xinjiang. And I'm simply I'm deeply tempted by or deeply attracted by the idea of getting one of the contracts to supply the household fixtures for one of these housing colonies. I mean, one of those would be enough to support my entire cluster for a year. You know, I want my government to speak to the Chinese and ask them that, hey, can you get these guys from Gujranwala or from Gujarat, from Wazirabad, contracts to supply ceiling fans, door handles, toilet bowls and flushes, kitchen sinks, wash basins. All of these are manufactured in Pakistan, in these SME clusters. And given the kind of markets opening up in Xinjiang, that cluster could really flower. But they couldn't even get an audience with the government at the time. But after the Panama verdict, when Nawaz Sharif was disqualified and decided to drive back in a blaze of glory from Islamabad all the way to Lahore, stopping along the GT road in exactly these towns, his finance minister stayed up for 2 nights in a row processing all of the sales tax refunds that had piled up from these same people. Literally the night before, all those checks were sent out. Well, they weren't checks. I think they were electronic transfers. But literally the night before. So they're buying back all of the support that they had lost along the way. That's typically what happens. And I'm just waiting to see. Imran Khan has said that, yes, we are going into this IMF program, but this will be the last. At one point, he has said that. This will be the last IMF program that Pakistan will take. We will break this cycle of eternal return. We will wake up from Groundhog Day, is what he's trying to say. What I'm waiting to now see is how they manage this, how they manage to undertake the stabilization without losing their support, and how they manage to advance the reform without activating the opposition. Given that their base of support is itself very, very fragile by comparison to the PBP and the PMLN, and also given that the kind of opposition that is already activated against them is far more vocal and far more active and far more strident than anything the PBP faced, anything the PMLN faced before them. So given these two realities, how they undertake these two steps, that will, I think, determine our pathway into the future.
Thank you for your perspective, Karan. As we are running short on time, I'll just remind the panelists to keep your remarks brief to 10 minutes if possible. Ms. Nabiwala, please, your remarks.
Okay, I'm watching the clock in the back. So I'm going to address 2 other questions that were put forward for this panel, which are 1 on youth and 2 on the role of aid in governance reform. My work focuses on the role of aid in development, and I say it that way because these 2 things are not the same. And secondly, on how the Pakistani government uses its own resources. Because if we're talking about going to the IMF, which is a short-term kind of crisis response to the economic situation right now, the ultimate question is going to be about long-term reform and building institutions in Pakistan that contribute to economic strength instead of depleting it, which is the situation that we have been in for a long time. So first on youth, Pakistan, of course, as everyone knows, has a huge youth bulge, and we need to develop institutions that respond to the demand and build institutions that people want to use, not the ones that we necessarily think that they need and end up supplying. So in education, for example, there is a huge demand for education in Pakistan already, and for a long time we've approached this in the opposite way, by trying to get people to demand education when actually it was a supply that didn't exist. You see the demand come up in 2 ways, primarily. First, 40% of kids in Pakistan go to private schools. And secondly, if you go to many schools in Pakistan, what you'll see is that a large number of kids are enrolled in kindergarten. The classrooms are packed. And by the time you get to 5th grade, there's been such high dropout that you'll have maybe a handful of students, maybe 2 left. And so we need to ask, why is it that people are not going back and continuing to use public resources that they are paying for through regressive taxation after they've tried it out the first time? And a lot of the answer is in what's actually happening in school. And so what we've seen over the last term in government, that a lot has actually happened to reform governance in education and the way that this sector is structured. So for example, where Pakistan had a big problem with teacher absenteeism, you have teachers showing up. Where we had a problem with infrastructure, the infrastructure has been fixed. Where we had a big problem with corruption and hiring, you have one of the successes that everyone claims is that we now have merit-based hiring. But we have not yet changed what happens in schools. And so whatever reform has happened around the edges to the way the sector is governed hasn't affected the experience that parents and children have in school. And so ultimately, this has not changed the utilization of government schooling or of public schooling in Pakistan. What you have instead is that people, like I said, are paying for public education. The budget this year, or actually last year, was about $8 billion for education. For a long time, we believed that it was a lot less. The number that was cited was often 2% of budget goes to education. And we heard this over and over again. Turns out the reality was that Pakistan spends 13% of its budget on education, and the difference was provincial spending, which nobody added. So we completely missed that we have a significant budget for education, which is now equal to the military budget. It's about $8 billion in education, $8 billion official military budget. The Stimson Center has estimated that if you add nuclear as the budget for nuclear assets as well, you would add about 15% to that budget. So we're paying $8 billion, or people are paying $8 billion for education, but parents are spending another $8 billion out of their pockets for private education. So the poor and the middle class actually in Pakistan are spending a large proportion of their income besides food on education. And they're paying that out of their pockets besides what they're already losing through sales taxes and other means. There are a number of things that we're missing. A lot of people may have already seen my work on the budget. And the conclusion of that work is that we have a teaching and learning crisis, that nothing is happening in schools. Kids are not learning. Conservatively, probably about 60% of children who do stay in school for 3 years cannot read. And a number, the international community, including reform programs in Pakistan, have come to the point of saying, maybe, we've doubled the budget, or Pakistan has doubled the budget. We've run the largest aid programs in the world here, and yet enrollment has stagnated. Maybe we have a teaching and learning crisis. And I think it's disappointing that after 15 years, 18 years of intensive work in Pakistan by the international community, we've come to this very obvious conclusion. A few weeks before I came here, I was going to Pakistani schools and asking students to read, and was very, it's disappointing and shocking that kids cannot read, consistent with the statistics. But what's even worse is that they're often learning to read languages that they actually don't speak. So for example, in Peshawar, kids are speaking Pashto. They don't understand basic Urdu, but they're learning to read and write in Urdu and in English. And they have textbooks in 4 languages: Urdu, English, Pashto, and Arabic. So the middle class actually gets the worst end of this deal because they are spending money, they're aspiring, they believe education is key to their futures, and so they're putting money into private schooling for their children. Like I said, 40% of kids in Pakistan go to private schools, mostly low-cost private schools that charge a few dollars a month. But in these private schools, the books are almost invariably in English. Meanwhile, teachers and students don't speak English. So the British Council did a survey and found that 94% of English medium private school teachers in Punjab do not speak English. So what do you expect if your book is in a foreign language and kids have to get through their curriculum if it's in English? All you're going to get is rote learning. And it says a lot that people in Pakistan have not recognized this issue. And that it's not only private schools that are in English, but now governments are increasingly switching their books to English. So in the last government, KP, which actually did very interesting work, I think, in education, they got a late start in 2013 with it. The most destructive thing that they did was to switch the province to English medium schooling. And they took pride in it, and it was in response to a lot of elite demand that the way to close the class gap is to have English medium schooling. What somehow everyone misses is that we don't have teachers who speak English, actually, in most of Pakistan, including cities, but definitely not in rural areas. So English is, I think, unless you address this problem of language, there's really no hope for what goes on in school. So now kind of where the governments are is after the last term when they fixed the cosmetics of education. And this is a credit to the international community as well as certain Pakistani governments in Punjab and KP for having the will to reform. They got as far as making a school look physically like a school with a teacher present. And a lot of that was done by sending monitors to schools who checked if teachers were there, who checked if students were there, and you saw absenteeism plummet. But now teachers have showed up, and either they cannot or will not do what needs to happen. And the challenge for the next government is harder in some ways, but really easier, not that hard, kind of in the big picture change that needs to happen, which is teaching and learning. And the first thing to do with that is to switch, drop English. And if English is going to happen, it needs to be taught as a second language, which is something that does not happen in Pakistan. So the interesting thing is we've heard a lot about out-of-school children and concerns about youth will, go to these out-of-school children. We've heard the number 23 million out-of-school children a lot. And this has driven governments to respond, and civil society as well, to address problems in primary schooling. But it turns out that about out of about 22 million children who are 5 to 9 years old, about 18 million of them are already enrolled in school. So the majority of your 5 to 9-year-olds in Pakistan are already enrolled. And of this 23 million number, 17 to 18 million of them are actually 10 to 16 years old. So while we have been using the 23 million number to address the problems of the 5-year-old, the 5-year-old has aged. And it's actually the 10 to 16-year-old, which is where our out-of-school crisis is. And as of yet, nobody has done anything about it. The 10 to 16-year-old, say an 11-year-old, cannot be enrolled into kindergarten. And yet they are illiterate. They're probably working by now. They need a different solution. And the bad news, but the opportunity is that children learn so little in 5 years of school that you can actually catch them up in 2 to 3 months. So it actually does not take much to be offering large-scale, countrywide, 2-month, 3-month non-formal literacy, numeracy, basic life skill programs to at least catch that population before they fall off of our statistics and become adults. But then after that, a lot of them do want to go back to school, and for some reason they couldn't or didn't. So after basic literacy and numeracy, they need grade 5 equivalency courses. They need the opportunity to come back into schooling. And it's shocking to me that while we've had this data in front of us, we've heard 23 million so much, how did we actually miss the problem? How did we miss the fact that all of our primary kids, so about 70 to 80% of them, are in school and they're not reading? And we can't talk about 21st century skills or competing with the global economy if your kids can't read. And they can't think because there's so much dissonance in their language of their education. And how did we miss that our crisis is actually teenagers who are still neglected and ignored? There are a number of other myths in our narrative. One of them is also about girls. This is, an example of, I think, of an international narrative defining national consciousness in Pakistan and elsewhere, not just in Pakistan. But if you look at the gender statistics, Pakistan has a 10% gender gap. But the 10% gap is actually an average of about a 2 to 3% gap in cities in Punjab and Sindh in the eastern half of the country, and a 30% gap in rural areas in Balochistan and KP. So there are places kind of on the eastern half of the country where the gender gap has narrowed. And no one has really recognized that this has happened. And to understand why this has happened, norms have changed a lot in cities, and schooling has become more available. And the thing is that demand for girls' schooling already existed. Pew did a survey a few years ago and found that about 91% of parents in Pakistan believe that education is equally important for boys and girls. So I don't know why we assumed that Pakistani parents agree with the Taliban, because they don't. And I think the same is true of Boko Haram. And I've gone around and asked, and there are actually a lot of data sets that will tell you the same thing, that over time, if you look at secondary school completion rates in Punjab, the gap has narrowed again between men and women. The labor force participation gap is still wide because the stigma is actually not on education, it's on mobility. And that's what keeps girls out of school, distance. So even LEAPS found recently that if you put a boy and a girl next to a school, it's equally likely that they both will attend. If you put the school farther away, then the likelihood of the girl attending drops. And I've asked, I've asked principals this question about, is it harder to keep boys or girls in school? Because actually the dropout rates are very similar between boys and girls. And they most of the time say boys, that it's harder to keep boys in school because there's a lot of pressure on boys to work. And I really fear that we're leaving boys behind when we don't need to, because Pakistan is not a place that has great education for boys and not for girls. Both are equally suffering. And where you see low enrollment for girls, you also have low enrollment for boys. And there are certain age categories in the statistics where you actually see more girls enrolled. In certain data sets, for example, Nielsen has found more girls than boys enrolled in urban Punjab and fairly equal in rural parts. So I think, interestingly, like I said before, the public sector has been mimicking the private schools to compete with them by adopting English books. But there's another way in which the public sector should be actually mimicking the private sector, which is in hiring women. So key to getting girls in school is A, distance, but B, what we don't talk about, which is that you need to have female faculty. The Citizens Foundation, who I work for, figured this out in the mid-1990s, which is another surprise as to why we're talking about it now. But the private sector in Pakistan tends to hire women, whereas government schools tend to hire men. And it's because of the way employment has happened in the public sector, usually on political grounds rather than really for the sake of education. In the last government, KP actually did make a policy change. And I remember the education minister had this eureka moment that, well, why don't we just hire women in the public sector? Because that's what the private sector is doing, and for a reason. This is what the public sector should be doing as well, and KP did make that change in the last government. I bring up women's employment in the public sector because education is actually a huge driver of employment for women, and it does change gender norms in a lot of small communities. The largest private employer of women today in Pakistan is an organization I work for called the Citizens Foundation, which is a schooling system. Because they hire only women as faculty, they have 12,000 female teachers and principals. They've become the largest private employer for women. And you see this more largely in the private sector. What a lot of my work has kind of shown me is that the narrative for change and for governance reform in Pakistan needs to be locally determined. And very strangely, what I find is that the elite narrative in Pakistan among those who have power and shape how resources are used often coincides with the international narrative. And internationals miss a lot of things that are happening even in the budget books in Pakistan. Nobody noticed when the budget doubled. Nobody noticed the increases in the education budget. People kept citing 2%, even though it was 13% for the education budget. And we miss what happens in schools completely. So I wish that kind of elite narratives about governance reform and development in Pakistan actually coincided more with local experience. Instead, you see a huge divorce there. If you look at, interestingly, aid is actually very small next to Pakistani government resources. Aid is about 9% of government spending or of government resources, and philanthropy is even bigger than aid. So, for example, there was a survey in 2014 that found that $2.4 billion was the value of what Pakistan had given in terms of cash or volunteer time, whereas the total value of US and UK aid was $1 billion. So there's a question there as to why, with less financial resources, the international community tends to shape the narrative and the interventions in Pakistan. And there's a need to kind of, I think, push back and flip that around, where Pakistan is defining what the agenda is. I'll make a last point about white elephants. There are the ones that we talk about that are very well known, the PIA, for example, but there are many that we don't see. And so when I'm talking about looking at the way Pakistan spends its own resources, there are a lot of white elephants there that we don't notice. One is the Earthquake Reconstruction Agency, ERA, which was created in 2006 to respond to the 2005 earthquake. It was supposed to be wound up in 2009. And in the end of 2009, the head of ERA wrote to the prime minister and said, you know, we are ready to be disbanded. Our mandate has now ended. It has been 3 years. You know, please shut us down. And Gilani responded by saying, you guys have done a great job. You are going to now become a permanent entity through an act of parliament. So ERA is still funded every year, even though it really doesn't have a job to do. And in 2013, Nawaz Sharif wrote and tried to disband ERA and say, okay, you guys are done, please go home. And turns out he couldn't do it, because now that it's an act of parliament, Parliament has to close ERA. ERA, meanwhile, has 700 employees. It sits on 44 acres of land. And I don't think ERA is the only one. And so it's a little shocking to me that we miss so much. And where is Parliament? Where is the oversight on the Pakistani government budget? Because that's where that comes from. And so far it looks like there is no oversight. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. Appreciate that. I'll ask Mr. Schwimlin to take your comments.
Sure. And I'm going to take your challenge of brevity seriously.
Thank
but
you.
But because I see the time. And so the first point I want to make is that I've been concerned for a long time about the self-isolating nature of Pakistan's economy. Over the last 20 years, the rest of Asia's economies have essentially opened and become party to international value chains and supply chains and trading, and then Pakistan is focused on textiles, on basic inputs, on raw cotton as which is its primary export to China today, and has been for the last decade. And that, Pakistan just hasn't stepped up and participated. That's consistent with the public investment trends that my colleagues up here have talked about. And that's consistent with a series of choices that have been made over 30 years. It's also the reason why, as my former colleague Laurel Miller said yesterday up here, it's hard to find a positive basis for U.S.-Pakistan relations. What Laurel said, and I endorse this fully, is that there's a reason why we have turmoil in U.S.-Pakistan relations, and that is that the focus is entirely on the negative. It's on terrorism, it's on nuclear weapons, it's on alleged and actual misbehavior, and it's grievance-filled. 30 years of underinvestment in Pakistan's economy, and 30 years of an aid-centric approach on the economic side from the United States has left it with very little positive attention to be paid to something else, to anything else. And so it's no wonder that the relationship is tumultuous. It's in that context that I want to talk about China and I think the CPEC role. I view, and I share the view of, I think, my fellow panelists, that China's role in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor has been a positive kind of line in to Pakistan at a time of an isolating trend. I have, looked at this pretty deeply, and I think much of the concern in Washington about China's role in Pakistan is misplaced, but not entirely. It may be misdirected, and I want to talk about where to direct it, where to direct the actual concern. In the earlier discussion, Dr. Hussain pointed out that Chinese firms, particularly independent power producers, entered the country on the basis of the same terms available to international companies. He cited the 1994 Independent Power Producers Regulation Framework as that, and pointed out that a U.S. company, AES, had come into Pakistan under exactly that framework with a guaranteed rate of return. 10 years ago, AES left the country. They walked away from their project. They liquidated the IPP they were involved in because they couldn't be paid because of circular debt. They weren't being paid tariffs regularly, and because they were being targeted by tax authorities as a foreign company who, as Khurram pointed out, is one of the areas of the tax net. The way in which revenue has been increased in recent years is to target foreign entities operating in Pakistan who feel bound to pay. And so AES left. In a couple of years, the question and the challenge for the Chinese will be exactly that. Are they going to be paid? Are they going to be subject to punitive taxation? Are their investments going to face the same challenges that other investments have in the past? And that is where I think the focus, when we think about China's role in Pakistan, the Belt and Road more broadly, needs to be. How is China going to deal with the dilemma of investing in places with complicated governance? Are they going to invest in help with reform and change to resolve the underlying concerns, to resolve the structural dilemmas, to invest in the workforce and educate the population? Or are they going to say, my way or the highway, and walk out the door, or demand repayment of debt? And that's when Washington talks about things like a debt trap. Is if China does not play the role of responsible stakeholder, that is the concern. It's not a concern today. It's a concern in a couple of years when debts start becoming due and these companies start facing the dilemma of repayment of their obligations. So I just want to highlight that. I do think Pakistan, and I do think that region more broadly, is an area where the United States and China share a lot of interests, and I hope that's not lost amid the push in Washington to kind of move more towards a competitive footing with Beijing. This is actually an area where stabilization, where private investment, and where our firms actually provide complementary services, and where we can economically collaborate in security terms, also find and test whether cooperation is possible. And finally, and I'll just make one last point. I think the other concern I have about the conversation about U.S.-Pakistan relations, and as I want to just insert that since we are here at the Wilson Center, and that's one of the things I was asked to address, concerned about a conversation about options about the future of the relationship and how to play, or whether there is economic leverage to be found against Pakistan, as my former colleague Henry Ensher said yesterday, that pressure, we will continue applying pressure, he said, until Pakistan changes its behavior. The concern is, I'm a creature of my generation. I inherited as a former U.S. policymaker, but as an American, policies towards Cuba, North Korea, and Iran that are anachronisms to me. I've never really understood them. And should we be in the business of punitively isolating states because we disagree with them? I don't think that makes a lot of sense. I think we're much better off finding ways to be open and finding ways to moderate our role. It's a good thing to me that U.S. civilian assistance levels have dropped, that we're reducing some of the grant and other types of concessionary support we provide to Pakistan. That's a way to signal behavior, but complete cutoffs of the relationship reduces our options. And I think economics, I think the private sector, I think people-to-people ties in the diaspora are really a basis for sustaining a more practical relationship into the future that can get us beyond turbulence. And I really hope that a shift towards punitive sanctions and the like kind of do not enter in more seriously the policy conversation here. But with that, we can move on.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the panel for this great insight and perspective into a very complex set of issues. Today we heard about the interplay of the twin deficit crisis and the importance of fiscal policy management as a response. We also heard about the lack of political will, and we unpacked that a little bit to look at the politics of burden sharing. We also looked at the poor outcomes coming from our current public expenditures and really smart solutions that wouldn't be terribly expensive to implement. And we also talked about the ease of doing business and the lack thereof in Pakistan and how critical it is to attracting FDI. And on a hopeful note, I think we heard from James about the importance of the region and the potential for economic cooperation between the United States and Pakistan and China. So I struggle a bit because we're running short on time, and I want to make sure that we have time for the audience. But I would, if you will permit me, one question that will hopefully allow you to have some just brief response is, I think we've talked about the efficiency of market solutions and the importance of the fiscal deficit reduction. We've talked, Dr. Ishrat spoke about the inefficiencies of the state-owned enterprises, and Dr. Akhtar talked about the importance of private sector mobilization and really ramping up that interest. I know that we'll be talking a little bit more this afternoon about the importance of the diaspora in terms of investment, as well as the broader U.S. private sector. So I guess one quick question I have for you is, what key sectors or state enterprises do you think are ripe now for privatization or commercialization or possibly just simply professionalization? Dr. Akhtar, if I may ask you to.
Well, a number of them can be privatized, but as the literature or experience of privatization will tell you, that you have to prepare firms to be privatized. So it's not as if you can just pick up one particular company. I mean, by and large, government has no business in a number of sectors, is a principle. Second is, you pick up companies that are much more commercial and make sure that you clean them a little in terms of the liabilities and then float to the market. Or if you are privatizing with burden, then appropriate provisions have to be made for that. But if you want a particular company, I think our Pakistan International Airlines is something that, despite all the baggage it has, is one candidate I can never understand why we can't privatize it. Because we get wedded with these institutions a lot. They are flagships and stuff like that. So clearly all the industries should be out from this. So to me, a more effective solution is to privatize them and give it to the new management to restructure. But of course, we have had some failures of privatization that have to be kept in mind. There are lots of lessons to be learned. I mean, Dr. Ishrat pointed out a successful experience of banking. We have an issue with few deals of privatization where we are not getting the right results for the consumers.
Well, we hope to unpack that a little bit more in the next session. Khurram, did you have something you'd like to add?
No, not really. I mean, I think there's a... Be like that.
No, we can listen to questions, I guess.
Yeah, I would add one thing. I agree on PIA. The ironic and maybe sad point is that 5 years later than the previous effort to privatize Pakistan International Airways, the market is more difficult today. The prospective buyers are starting to face trouble themselves from privatization, so the pathway is even more treacherous than it was before. The other thing I'd say is I actually would expand the question a little bit to also focus on the industries that are state affiliated but not necessarily state owned. I talk about here shipping, transportation, fertilizer production and manufacturing, lots of petrochemicals, lots of industries that are, when you look at it, military adjacent, largely the part of the pension program for the Army, essentially, that these are really market functions that can be performed and create a lot, I think, broader growth and potential than exists in their current form.
Thank you, James. I appreciate that. Okay, we have time for just a few brief questions. I'll ask for you to wait until you have a microphone in front of you. Please state your name and your affiliation. I request that you ask one question. Please make it brief and no comments, long comments. So we'll start with this young woman here with the gray sweater.
Thank you very much. My name is Arifa Khalid. I have been member of the parliament for 10 years, previous 10 years in Pakistan. I really liked the approach. I think everything, what is said here, thank you very much. And Mr. Khurram, as you said, I think the example you gave of a businessman, I think that shows that our sovereignty is very important. At the same time, when we invite other countries, are we looking after that in these projects? And Madam, as you said, that English is very important, of course, but to me, I think even when you see in USA, we see that many people come from Korea, from Iran, from everywhere, from China. They learn English here and they go to the schools, to the universities. I mean, there are IELTS programs, there are English as second language programs. So I think your emphasis on English, I like to know that are you also emphasizing on the curriculum, or you're just emphasizing on the English medium schools or in the public school? So that I didn't hear in your conversation, and that's my question, that what curriculum are you actually trying to follow in your programs in Pakistan?
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll take two more questions and then open it up for a round of answers. The woman in the black? Thank you.
Thank you. My question is regarding Pakistan is going to the IMF soon. I was on the tax reform project of the World Bank back in 2005 to 2011. And unfortunately, the tax to GDP ratio declined after that 7 years project of over 150 million US dollars. I want to ask Dr. Shamshad, Akhtar, and Khurram if they can come up with one concrete thing, like what should be done differently to avoid Groundhog Day again and again. Khurram talked about the VAT thing, and I was on the project, and I knew from the beginning that VAT is not going to take off, the reformed GST at that time. When we were spending money to procure the consultants and to do the legislation and everything, but we knew from the day one that it's not going to take off because of the lack of the political will. So what new thing or what concrete steps that the Pakistan government can negotiate with the IMF at this time, so this could hopefully be the last program, which I doubt.
And we'll take one more question way in the back, in the corner.
My name is Nasir, and I am associated with Indus. My question is, the current PTI government is recovering land in Islamabad and other parts of country from land grabbers, which cost like billions of rupees and hopefully few $1 billion as well. So is there any plan, or government is considering any plan to sell that land out in market and use that revenue for deficit in its economy, or it can also use that for building those 5 million houses that government has promised? So do you think that would there be any possibility government would consider any option?
Thank you for that. Dr. Akhtar, would you care to?
Well, I wouldn't be able to answer the last question because I really don't know what the government's plan on it is. But surely, as somebody who wants to support a fiscal external injection, I think it is a great idea to sell it. But at the same time, as you said, there's a housing mission that the government has to fulfill. Let me try to address the IMF thing. I actually think that, to me, IMF is not into a major overhaul of the taxation structure. Normally, in the design of their program, they are putting in X% of GDP to be raised, and they would have 2 or 3 really items out there that they would recommend that they be targeted. I do hope that there is more attention to the restructuring, but my own perspective is we do need an overall of the tax policy regime. And that was my point, that we need legislative engagement to broaden our tax base. We have been looking at the issue of expanding the tax filers, through gimmicks that we have found out. And I think that's very important. And there are some very interesting techniques that are going on, like through the national ID system, digitization and others, which will help in bringing in the ambit, who is banking and who is buying a car and stuff like that. That database innovation is going to help in expanding the list of the tax filers. Right now we have 700,000 in the tax net. We clearly should be looking at 10 to 15 to 20 million. So I do hope that under the tax reform project, I am a little biased on the World Bank. My own experience on World Bank technical assistance for the taxation authorities, my own assessment is, and evaluation has been, that it has really not helped Pakistan. And that is why I think the ownership has to be taken over by the government on the overhauling of the tax reform. And we need to segregate the tax policy element from the other. And I think the whole culture of the tax collectors need to be looked into. So there's a massive thing that needs to be done. I can't tell you, you do this and you'll get 2% of GDP. Yes, if you tax the doctors, lawyers, as we tried to do in the Philippines, which was facing a similar dilemma, and I was then at the Asian Development Bank, you do get some higher revenue spin. So you could pick up some of these items, but I think it's best done by the government. It has the database now.
Thank you very much. I know, Nadia, the question about curriculum, if you'd care to.
Yeah. Just to clarify, what happens in America is that if a child speaks a different language, they are given a teacher who speaks that language, at least if there's a critical mass. So a Spanish-speaking student is given a teacher who speaks Spanish. Even a Urdu-speaking Pakistani child, if there are enough Pakistani children in New York, will be given a teacher who speaks Urdu. And so the whole idea of forcing languages on children is not something that is done in advanced economies. So with the rest of the curriculum, a number of the problems that you see with reading are actually the problems with the rest of the curriculum. So if you look at, in Pakistan, there's an obsession with curriculum about the books and the content and what it says, and let's standardize this and make it uniform. And to the extent that, it's kind of handed out by governments bureaucratically, and teachers over the course of the year are just completely occupied with getting through it and kids memorizing it. And so the skills are completely neglected. And so the same thing is happening with reading, where kids are actually being taught to read by rote. So there's actually no reading happening. Kids are actually reciting. Teacher will go through the alphabet, the kids will recite it. Teacher will say, this is how you spell a word, the kids will recite it. So at no point are they actually learning to read, or what a letter sounds like, or how do you combine these sounds. And it's very, very strange. And this is actually happening in KG, kindergarten. And so they learn the letters by some type of rote system. When you ask teachers, where are you teaching reading, they actually don't understand the question. It took me 3 schools to figure out where kids were being taught the closest semblance to this. And what they said was, as I kept saying, where are you teaching reading, and what grade, in what subject? I've been to 3 schools now, I've talked to every class, I don't get where this is happening. And they finally said, oh, Jortor, which is combining and breaking apart letters, which are written in kind of the Urdu cursive. And so that's the mechanical that most that kids learn in kindergarten. When they get to grade 1 and you ask to see an Urdu lesson, invariably it was about Allah Ta'ala and the Prophet. Long passages about creation. And so what's also happened is that because we're so blind to skills, that curriculum departments, and this is official policy, in education departments, and they take pride in this, have taken language as an opportunity to just fill it with content about ideology. And so because we have a crisis of, a lack of civic values in Pakistan, they think they can build moral character by putting all this content all over the textbooks. And I'm not just talking about religion or extremism, but just a general deficiency in a sensibly structured curriculum that teaches language or any subject is suddenly all trying to shape moral values in citizens, in Pakistanis and Muslims. And so there's a huge incoherence, and it starts with this problem, of reading, but it's actually throughout their curriculum. And what you're happening is when you get to university, all that kids can do is plagiarize.
Karim, would you care to add?
Sure. I was asked by Arfa that are we safeguarding our sovereignty in the dealings with the Chinese? And the best answer I can give is I sincerely hope so. Because look, at the moment there is no evidence at all that Pakistan is bargaining with its sovereignty in any of its dealings with China. But given the speed with which the economic relationship is growing, and given the depth to which it is going to go, or is planned to go in the decade to come, there are clear reasons, or there are clear indications that sovereignty-related stakes are going to be in play in this. Are we safeguarding at the moment? There's no need. There is no requirement as such. But as we move on further down the road, I think that will become a priority. And I sincerely hope that governments to come will adequately look after Pakistan's interests. And regarding the tax reform, I'll slightly disagree with Dr. Shamshad here. From 1988 till 2008, in those 20 years, every IMF program that Pakistan signed, and mashallah, we had lots of them, with the exception of one, the standby in 2000, because that was a short-term standby facility only. All of them actually had tax reform as a central part of the structural reforms. The GST, the move towards adoption of a GST came into the IMF programs in '88, and the 2008 was the last program to have it. When I spoke with the IMF people in 2013, when the 13 program was being negotiated, they said, because that was the first time after 2 decades that tax reform was not at the heart of an IMF program. The EFF signed in 2013. And their response was, well, we've tried for 20 years. And if they don't want tax reform, fine, don't. They don't want to do a VAT. It's okay, but just give us a credible path to increasing reforms and increasing documentation nonetheless. Now, when you move away from the value-added tax as a documentation exercise and as a consumption tax, you say, okay, we're going to expand the tax net through our own ways. One impediment that Pakistan has is the lack of depth in Pakistan's own economic conversation, internal. So developing, when rulers look to domestic sources for ideas on how to undertake tax reform, what they come back with typically are clever little ideas, but not really a vision. So, this idea of having an active taxpayer list is I think is a very good idea. It's a very good reform in terms of promoting a culture of tax filing. And as a long-term thing, it's very helpful that more and more people are now waking up to the fact that filing your tax returns is an obligation upon you. I don't think that's a bad thing at all. But will it yield revenues in the short term? No. Does it substitute or will it promote documentation even over a 3-year period? No, not really. It'll just get you far more tax filers. And you're going to have to keep closing a lot more doors to the non-filers. What are you going to do? What are the best homegrown ideas for how to promote documentation? There are none, really. And the kind of people that the finance minister has to speak to include people like the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Pakistan, the Association of Income Tax Lawyers of Pakistan, or the Federation of Pakistan Chambers of Commerce and Industry, or these are the people that they turn to, or they turn to the FPR and the bureaucrats themselves. And then you get clever little ideas. Let's try and triangulate from Nadra database and see if we can spot high consumption individuals who are not in the tax net and whatnot. Developing a vision to promote documentation is going to be a challenge. And I think doing that domestically is not going to be possible, just given the sheer shallowness of whether it comes from the IMF or the World Bank like the VAT did, or whether it comes from some other kind of an engagement with external expertise, it's going to be essential. It'll be required.
I want to connect the sovereignty question to the tax question, and the documentation question, because I actually think that's very interesting. One of the solutions that there are a lot of economies face these challenges. One of the solutions that is being pursued, in sub-Saharan Africa, comes to e-banking and mobile banking. In Pakistan, the Chinese are taking the lead, actually, in introducing a lot of e-banking capabilities and financial purchase to 40% stake in Telenor. For those who haven't kind of tracked this, with the intention of really pushing out, particularly in the Northwest and in areas that are unbanked, as they would say, access to mobile banking technology. Now, in a country that I've had a lot of conversations over a number of years about banking in particularly the tribal areas or the former tribal areas and in Baluchistan, and in the country that is, as a government, so sensitive about access to financial information about those areas, it will be interesting to see how an increasingly e-banked or mobile banked population, if that indeed takes place as these entities push out, is subject to anti-money laundering, counter-terror finance, counter-illicit finance, oversight and supervision. Ant and the Chinese so far, have an okay track record with this, but it's an area where, as the concern about sovereignty as defined by the Pakistani military, in particular over a period of decades, is going to come in direct competition with the commercial instincts of Alibaba, one of the largest companies in the world. And it will be very interesting to watch how that happens.
Well, thank you for that, James. And I want to thank everyone for this discussion. It's a testament to how intriguing and topical this conversation is, that we've run over a little bit, and we're going to be asking you to catch up over time. But first, I'd like to just thank my distinguished panelists for a very interesting conversation. So I'll just let everyone know that we are running a little short on time. I know that we've been given a lot to think about and things to watch for as Pakistan gets ready for the IMF team to visit. Please take about half an hour to have some lunch. We have a really great discussion coming up after lunch at 1:45. We'll be talking about the diaspora's role in Pakistan's economic development. And lastly, if someone has a Zara beige colored jacket, please come and talk to me. Thank you.